Hello everyone and welcome to Pocket Size Bio of Dr. Casco. In today's video, we're going to look at Chapter 8, an introduction to metabolism. So this chapter is broken down into 5 sections, getting into the general concepts of energy transformation and metabolism of an organism or of a cell, free energy change of a reaction that essentially will tell us whether or not a reaction will occur spontaneously or is energetically favorable. Section 8.3 is ATP power cellular work by coupling exergonic reactions to endergonic reactions. And then we spend time on 8.4 and 8.5 talking about enzymes, right? Their characteristics and how they help chemical reactions occur more effectively. So we see here in the picture, figure 8.1, the green glowing spots on the outside of this Brazilian termite mound are larvae of the click beetle, right? Pyrophorus nyctophanes, if I'm saying that correctly. These larvae convert the energy stored in organic molecules to light, okay, a process called bioluminescence. We'll see this a lot more in detail in the later chapters, which attracts termites that the larvae eat. Bioluminescence and other metabolic activities in a cell are energy transformations that are subject to physical laws. So we're going to see this a little bit more in detail, laws of thermodynamics, but in a more biology context. So not too much calculations and things like that you'll see in a physics course, right? Just the principles that will that are involved in biological processes. Okay. First law of thermodynamics: energy can be transferred and transformed, but cannot be created or destroyed. Okay. Sorry about that bell. As you can see here, light energy from the sun is coming in. It is transformed by plants into chemical energy, right, in organic molecules like glucose, and then it's transformed by mites, as the termites eat plants, into other forms of chemical energy. That chemical energy can then be transformed by these click beetle larvae into bioluminescent or light energy. So these transformations we're going to get into. One thing to note is that in the second law of thermodynamics, every energy transfer or transformation increases entropy. There's a concept we're going to see also in this chapter, or disorder of the universe. Right, for example, during every energy transformation, some energy is converted to thermal energy and released as heat. Every chemical reaction has some energy lost in the form of heat. We're going to take a look at. Okay, so let's get into 8.1, section 8.1. An organism's metabolism transforms matter into energy. Right. So we probably know from middle school the totality, right, or all the chemical reactions that an organism does in their body is called metabolism. And this is an emergent property because you're having molecules that are interacting together to create a new thing, right? So a new level of complexity. So this would be an example of an emergent property. Metabolic reactions, they usually undergo in the form of pathways where you have the products of one reaction coming in and becoming the reactant of another reaction, right? So it's you seldomly have a chemical reaction in isolation, right, in a biological system. So there's an interconnecting roadmap that I'm going to show you in a little bit of many chemical reactions that are interacting together. Okay, they're called pathways. And many of these pathways intersect. Okay, as I mentioned before, right, a specific molecule that is a reactant of reacting with other molecules, undergoes a chemical reaction and will become a product. And then that molecule, ultimately, those reactants will change over time, over different reactants, ultimately resulting in a final product. Okay, and usually these reactions are aided by specific enzymes. More specifically, they're catalyzed. Okay, you can see this diagram here of what I'm referring to. So you have the starting molecule undergoes a chemical reaction with the help of enzyme number 1 to become, product number B, and then product C via reaction 2, and then product D to have that final product. Okay, so there are many mechanisms that regulate this process. Among these, enzymes are fundamental to chemical reactions, to these pathways. Okay, how often this occurs does depend on supply and demand of the needs of the organism. Okay, and this is a very effective way for the organism to manage material and energy resources. And metabolism and metabolic pathways can be broken down into 2 types. You have catabolic pathways, or catabolism, okay, which is essentially you're breaking down complex molecules into simpler molecules. An example of this is cell respiration, and this is a chemical reaction that releases energy, and it does produce ATP, but it's an exergonic reaction. Ultimately, you break down glucose to produce carbon dioxide and water via the use of oxygen. A very complex series of reactions and pathways. We're going to see that in the later chapters. Of course, you need energy to do some of these reactions, ultimately to produce ATP. Okay, an example of where you would see this: muscle contractions, cilia beating in the membrane transport. So catabolic pathways, breaking down complex molecules into smaller ones. Then you have anabolic pathways. They're also referred to as biosynthetic pathways. It's also called anabolism. Okay? And you use energy to build more complex molecules. Some examples of these are amino acid synthesis, protein synthesis, glucose, right, production, basically photosynthesis. So in all these, in all these reactions, you do need some form of energy, right? But these particular anabolic reactions will absorb a lot more energy, so they're high energy products. Okay. Ultimately, energy is fundamental to be able to produce and carry out these reactions. Okay. Going a little bit back, and again, this is beyond the scope of college bio or AP bio, but I just want to show you a diagram of how metabolic pathways are interconnecting. Right, there's many molecules that can undergo several different pathways, like a railroad map or a train map here. Citric acid cycle produces, malate as one of its kind of reactants inside the cycle. This one can go into this particular cycle, and so forth, right? So there are many pathways that interconnect, again, depending on the necessities of the cell. Okay? Don't worry at all about this diagram. I just wanted to show you a visual of how complex it can be. Okay? The study of how energy flows within living organisms and living systems is called bioenergetics. Okay? Let's just continue on here. So talking a little bit more about energy. Energy is the capacity to perform work or to cause a change on something. And there's several forms of energy, as we all know. And one form of energy can be converted to another form. And in terms of biological processes, there's many energy transformations, as we're going to take a look at. Going more specifically, right, there's these main groups of energy. So you have kinetic energy, kinetic energy associated with motion. Okay, and for biology, we get into, moreover, the motion of molecules. Okay? And these motion of molecules, right, it's a form of kinetic energy, and they're associated more specifically with thermal energy and heat, right? As they're moving, they do produce, liberate some heat. Chemical reactions are liberating heat, and so forth. So you have that energy in motion. Thermal energy would be a type of kinetic energy. And then when you're passing that energy down, just transferring that energy is referred to as heat, as we've seen in the previous chapters. Okay? Heat, again, as I mentioned before, is released during metabolic reactions, and it contributes, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, to an increased entropy in the surroundings. Okay? So basically, heat, when you liberate heat, you're going to pass that energy to molecules, let's say in the air. It's going to make them move a lot more. So that's called, you're increasing entropy, you're increasing disorder, okay? Randomness into the environment. Kinetic energy. Then you have potential energy. It's an energy that is associated with position or the structure of matter. Okay. And chemical energy is a form of potential energy. Okay. And here you have energy stored in the arrangement of the atoms and in the chemical bonds that are formed between atoms could have chemical energy. And energy could be released or absorbed during chemical reactions when bonds are broken and new bonds are formed. So depending on the reaction, you're going to have a net gain of energy or a net release of energy. Okay, but there's always have in mind that association that chemical bonds can carry energy there. Okay, so chemical energy powers cellular work. We're going to see this with the form of ATP in a bit. So for now, just understand that. Have that in the back of your mind. Chemical energy powers cellular work. Living systems rely primarily on chemical energy stored in molecular bonds. Again, I'm mainly ATP. And you're always having energy transformations, okay, occurring in biological systems. This is a nice example of, kinetic and potential energy. You have a diver that is up in the plank that is about to, jump off. Just because he's in a certain position or a certain height from the ground, he has potential energy. Okay, he can fall off, and that fall can not fall off, but dive off. Okay, he has that form of energy that will ultimately convert into kinetic energy. As the diver jumps down, that potential energy is changing into kinetic energy. Okay, let's continue on. All right. Again, as I mentioned before, you have the concept of thermodynamics. Okay, thermodynamics is a study of energy transformations that occur in a collection of matter. Now, there's some concepts that you need to be familiar with as we go along through the chapter. A system, right? A system is that matter or that organism that you're studying or that you want to figure out what's happening with energy transformations. Okay, the system. Let's say a cell, for example. Okay, the surroundings, of course, is the environment around that cell. Okay, this is everything outside of the system. Okay, in this case, you have a little picture. These diagrams are not part of the textbook. You have a little cell, and you have your surroundings there. Air molecules or water molecules and whatnot. Okay, an isolated system refers to any system that cannot exchange energy or matter with its surroundings, or is incredibly difficult to do so. Let's say a liquid and a thermal bottle that are very good insulators, right? This will be an isolated system. An open system, you can exchange both energy and matter with its surroundings, what we usually think about living organisms and their surroundings, right? It's an open system. We're in constant exchange of energy and matter. Okay, as organisms are open systems, we'll be focusing more on that. Okay? So they absorb energy in any form, chemical energy, light energy in the case of plants, okay, and so forth. One thing that organisms do, these systems, right? They release heat and metabolic waste products. We're always releasing heat, okay? And we're releasing waste products, carbon dioxide, right? Um, uh, water vapor as we exhale, for example, to the surroundings. And again, you're always having energy transformations. And these energy transformations are governed by two laws of thermodynamics. Okay. The first law of thermodynamics, the energy in the universe is constant. Okay, so there's like a net amount. And energy can be transferred and transformed. You can pass it from one system to another, and you can convert it from one form of energy to another. You cannot destroy energy or create energy. There's always just a conversion of energy. Okay. The first law is called the principle of conservation of energy. Okay. Energy producers do not create energy, okay, but convert it to usable forms. In our biosphere and in the Earth, of course, ultimately, with certain exceptions, the majority of living organisms, they get their energy from producers, which they themselves get energy from the sun. Okay, and they convert light energy to chemical energy. Okay. A brown bear converts chemical energy in food into kinetic energy, and then other forms of chemical energy here. Now, I'm just going to zoom in for a little bit here. This bear, is hunting for fish, eats the fish, gets chemical energy to move about. As he's moving about, he's liberating some heat there, releasing carbon dioxide and water. Okay. Now, second law of thermodynamics: during every energy transfer or transformation, some of that energy will be converted into thermal energy, into heat. Okay, and this is like the key thing, right? Heat is that form of energy is unavailable to do work. It's not useful energy, right? To do something within the organism. So it's liberated as thermal energy, heating up the environment. Only a small fraction of the chemical energy from food is converted to motion. Most energy is lost as heat. And then, of course, it dissipates into the surroundings. Okay? The only time that thermal energy can do work if there's a difference in temperature. Okay? Heat flows from warmer regions to cooler regions. You can think about currents and different temperatures of currents as you get motion there, and so forth. So you got that motion, okay? As it's yes, okay. In living cells, temperature is relatively uniform because we're generating heat at a pretty constant rate. As the chemical reactions that we're doing can help warm the organism. Okay, and we can feel that heat, right, by its effects. A crowded room becomes warm just because of the heat of the individuals in that room that's crowded. Okay, continue on. Loss of usable energy as heat increases disorder in the universe. So what do you mean? What does it refer to in physics as disorder? So it's dispersed energy in a system, right? Heat that is dissipating into the environment. And this disorder, this energy that is being liberated into the environment will enable systems to become and their environment to become disordered. Let's say you have this ice flake, for example, and you have these little water molecules. As you gain more heat, that ordered structure of a snowflake will become disordered. And basically, there's a lot more randomness. Molecules are moving everywhere. Particles of water are just randomly going their own way. So this is what I'm referring to as disorder. An increase in energy and heat will increase disorder, randomness in the environment. Okay? And that's what entropy is. Now, entropy is a measure of molecular disorder or randomness in an environment. Okay, greater randomness corresponds to greater entropy. Okay, so entropy, remember, is this idea that molecules are just moving about in a random way. How strong they're moving, you can think of that as entropy. So it's a measure of how much randomness the particles are moving in. Okay. The second law of thermodynamics is that every energy transfer increases the entropy of the universe because you're getting heat liberated there. Okay. Every energy transfer will increase entropy. All right. Every energy transfer will increase entropy. So you can have order increase locally. Let's say you have chemical reactions that are creating very stable, organized products, as we see in living systems, or at least the formation of ice structures. Okay, but as you're increasing that, you're removing energy from that structure. Okay, that will be given to the environment. So this is what this little statement refers to. Order can increase locally within a particular thing that you're observing, but the overall entropy in the universe will increase. Okay. So some examples of increasing entropy: physical disintegration of organized structures will increase entropy. Okay. Decaying of unmaintained buildings, right? So you're getting certain forms of reactions and chemical and energy that will break down a building, deteriorate over time. Okay. Just because of an increase in entropy. Much of that entropy occurs or increases as heat is released. Okay. So as more heat is released, there's the formation of less ordered matter. Okay. When a bear, again, going back to this image of the bear, as the bear, it has eaten, it got the fish, as it's breaking down the energy that you can get from food, it's going to be using that to move about. And it's converting chemical energy to kinetic energy. And all these chemical reactions, conversions, and energy conversions, heat is released. Okay. As heat is released, that's going to, again, move the particles better, but you're also adding particles within the environment, carbon dioxide and water. So the surrounding overall will become more disordered. Okay. All right. So entropy helps explain why certain processes occur without any energy input. Okay. There's two terms that we need to think about: spontaneous process. Now, in this case, spontaneous means that it's energy favorable. Okay, it's energy favorable. It's an energy favorable process. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to occur 100% like quickly. It just means that it's energy favorable and it's most likely to occur by itself without a net input of energy. Okay. Now, these type of processes, and we're going to see some examples, they increase entropy. Okay. It is energetically favorable, as I mentioned. They don't require more energy being put in. But again, something to note, that spontaneous does not mean that it's going to occur, instantaneously. It will occur because you don't need any additional input of energy. Okay. Some spontaneous processes are very fast, like explosions, but some spontaneous processes are slow, like the rusting of a car. You don't need to add more energy for the chemical reaction of rusting to occur. It just happens, but it's a slow process. So that's what spontaneous process means, that it's going to occur. You don't need any additional energy for the reaction to occur. Okay. And then you have non-spontaneous processes where they decrease entropy. Okay. They require an energy, an input of energy. Non-spontaneous. Water moves uphill only if you add energy to it. Okay, if you're pumping water up a hill to supply a neighborhood in a valley or whatnot, right? You need energy to pump water upwards. This is a non-spontaneous process. Okay, in doing so, you will produce heat. So non-spontaneous processes will produce heat, and it'll increase entropy in the surroundings as a consequence. So I'm going to put that as a little uh, subtext there, because it kind of chains it together. So it produces heat, and as a consequence, increases entropy. Okay. Total entropy of the universe still increases. Everything we do, when we use energy and when we convert energy within just our biological maintenance, right, growth and whatnot, we're going to produce heat. So the entropy in the universe will be increasing. Okay. Again, now focusing on more specifically on biological systems. So you have biological order and disorder, right? Living systems, they increase entropy in their surroundings, okay? And within the cell, you can create many ordered structures from less organized materials. Let's say you're having a lot of monomers of sugars or proteins and whatnot. You want to put them together. Okay, all of that requires energy to produce a polypeptide chain. Let's say for example. So you're producing order in the cytoplasm, in the cell, gene expression, protein synthesis, but you need energy, and as a result of that, you're producing heat, and from less organized materials, just the amino acids, just swimming around, you're going to create ordered structures. So that's what that means. Okay. Complex biological structures arise from simpler components. And again, an increase in internal order is balanced by, you're taking in matter and energy, you're consuming energy, you're taking in matter. And as a consequence of that, you're going to release, right? Energy is heat, carbon dioxide, water, in the case of cell respiration. Okay, less ordered matter. So animals consume complex molecules. Okay, these are catabolic pathways, break down CO2 and water. Okay, but you were able to produce this particular structure. Let's say in a glass sponge, this little skeletal system, that it has there. It doesn't really have a skeletal system, but just this structure that it has here. Okay. Architects have modeled this picture you see here is just that architects model from living organisms these very organized structures. Okay. So products contain less chemical energy than the original food. Energy loss is accounted for by heat. Again, always have heat in the back of your mind in this whole idea of thermodynamics. At an ecosystem level, you can still see this happening. Energy enters as light, is being processed into chemical energy by photosynthesis, and energy exits as heat in the overall environment. Okay. A little bit of context in terms of evolution and life and entropy. Sorry about that. Complex organisms evolved from simpler ancestors. Again, green algae aggregating together, having more sophisticated interactions, ultimately has led to plants, flowering plants, which have some of the most organized arrangements that we can see in the plant world. Okay? Petal arrangement, things like that. Leaf arrangement. So an increase in biological organization doesn't violate thermodynamics. You always have to follow, or you're bound by these laws. Entropy in a system may decrease, but the total entropy of the universe must increase. Okay, must increase. So organisms themselves are islands of low entropy in an increasingly random universe. Okay? So evolution is a biological disorder will always be consistent with thermodynamic laws. Okay. All right. Okay, so now we're going to talk about 8.2, which is free energy and chemical reactions. Free energy, or free energy change, is a concept developed by Willard Gibbs, in which free energy is the portion of a system's energy that is available to do work. So it's the energy that is actually applicable to do something, and it's expressed as free energy change, designated by delta G. Okay, and G is calculated as the free energy of the products minus the free energy of the reactants. As you see here, delta G is G in the final state minus G in the initial state. And its formal equation, is delta G equals a change in enthalpy. Enthalpy is the total energy in a system, right? The total heat content that is in a particular system. Okay. And so you have this delta H, right? Enthalpy minus temperature, which is multiplied by a change in entropy, delta S. And the value of delta G predicts whether a reaction will occur spontaneously. So it can tell you, is this reaction energetically favorable or not? Will it occur spontaneously or not? And many scientists over the years have conducted many experiments to figure out that delta G can be for a reaction that is considered spontaneous, delta G must be negative. Okay, delta G must be negative, and it could be measured for any reaction under specific environmental conditions, with pressure and temperature and whatnot. So delta G is generally negative for reactions that are spontaneous, and under these conditions, you can have these parameters for it to be considered spontaneous. So enthalpy must be negative. Enthalpy, right? Delta H. So you must give up enthalpy, so the total energy in the system. So you must be liberating heat content. And this T delta S must be positive. So there must be an increase in the measure of disorder. Okay, so you must be increasing disorder. Every spontaneous process decreases the system's free energy, or that usable energy. Okay. Regarding stability and equilibrium and free energy, you can, again, as I mentioned before, delta G can be thought of as the difference between a system's free energy in the final state minus the initial free energy. And again, as I mentioned before, for a reaction to be negative, the system must lose free energy during the reaction change as the reaction is progressing, it's forwarding. Okay. You can think about free energy as a system's instability, or in its tendency for a system to change to a more stable state. For a system to change to a more stable state. Okay. Let's take a look at this at these pictures here. So this is a nice representation of what I'm talking about: the relationship of free energy to stability, work capacity, and spontaneous change. Unstable systems are systems that have high energy, high free energy. Okay, and you have some examples here. Let's say a diver that is a swimmer that is on top of a plank, right? A swimming board, plank, however you call it. At this point, he has less stability, right? He has more free energy, so you have more ability to do work. As he jumps down into the water, dives down into the water, there is a spontaneous change because you have you have higher G and you're less stable. So the free energy of the system, as you undergo the spontaneous change, will decrease. Delta G will become less than 0. The system will become more stable now because the free energy has been released, and so forth. Okay, so at the end, there's less free energy. The system is less stable, so there's less work capacity. The same happens in diffusion at the molecule level. In any situation here, you have, let's say, a drop of dye in water. You have a concentrated area of particles. As the particles are very tight together, you have less stability. There's more free energy. After a while, the particles will diffuse. They'll spread out until you have stability in the system, right, in the environment. The same thing with molecules that have a lot of energy, like glucose. As they break apart and they're processed into smaller and smaller molecules, more stable molecules like carbon dioxide. In this particular case, you're having a change in free energy. Okay? So these are examples of how you're getting stability and free energy within a system. Okay, everything wants to move forward toward a more stable state. Ultimately, equilibrium. Equilibrium means that on both sides, or everything in a system has been balanced out. There's equal concentrations on different sides, amounts of energy, and so forth. So there's no net change in the system. Okay. Free energy increases when the system is out of equilibrium. That's an interesting thing that we're going to take a look at later. So in terms of free energy and metabolism now that we have this idea of stability, in terms of metabolism, you have exergonic reactions and endergonic reactions. Exergonic reactions are reactions that have a negative delta G value. It means that there's a net release of energy, okay, to the surroundings. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And the products contain less free energy than the reactants. The majority of that energy has been dissipated into the environment. Exergonic reactions are spontaneous under normal cell conditions, and many catabolic reactions that break down stuff are exergonic. Is the example during cell respiration, where you have glucose breaking down into carbon dioxide and water, right? You have a net liberation of energy, delta G being negative 686 kilocalories per mole, right? And you can see this example here. An exergonic reaction, you have reactants, they have a high amount of free energy, as in the case of glucose. And as they progress and energy is being released or extracted from this reaction, the products, carbon dioxide and water, will be very low energy products, right? So they're very stable products. That energy that is being released, could be used, some of it, a lot of it's lost as heat, but it's used to undergo many other chemical reactions, like the ATP production. Okay, so the amount of energy release goes down for exergonic reactions. Okay, so now we're going to talk about endergonic reactions. And endergonic reactions, they have a positive G value, and these reactions will require an input of energy to proceed. So the products contain more free energy than the reactants, meaning that they're also non-spontaneous on their own. They need to have energy inputted in them. Many anabolic reactions are endergonic. Very common example, very famous example, as we're going to study later on, is photosynthesis and active transport also. You can take a look here at this panel at B, endergonic reactions, energy required, so it's non-spontaneous. So if you take a look, very low energy reactants like water and carbon dioxide, if you input a light energy, okay, photosynthesis, that light energy will enable these chemical reactions to progress, and ultimately the products will have a lot of free energy within their chemical bonds, as the case of sugar, right, of glucose. So endergonic reactions. Ultimately, one thing that you need to note is this concept of equilibrium, right? At equilibrium, free energy change is zero. And if there's no free energy present in the environment and in the system, no net work can be done. Okay, there's no net work. So essentially the cell dies. Living cells are never in equilibrium. You always want to have some form of gradient occurring in the cell, because they keep that'll enable the cell to keep working and keep working and keep working. Once you have a system where there is no longer any form of free energy, like let's say here, you have a well, or like this system of hydroelectric system, that you have a lot of water here that is flowing down for this turbine to move to produce energy. Okay. Ultimately, if you don't have any more water in this particular well, then there isn't going to be any change, any movement of the turbine to produce electricity. So in this case, you have equilibrium. Okay, nothing will work anymore. So no more light will be produced, as an analogy to the idea that if cells are in net equilibrium, that's when essentially the cell will die. Okay, it's a very interesting concept. I'll just move up here. Okay, so a living cell is not in equilibrium. Materials will be flowing in and out always, always, always. So again, back to this analogy of a hydroelectric system. If you have this faucet of water providing matter into this system, you can have a turbine constantly, rotating and rotating and rotating and rotating. So you can have light being produced. Okay, light being produced, this whole system in the environment, you have a delta G that is less than zero. Okay, water's flowing out. So you can think about this as, molecules coming in, doing the chemical reactions, moving the turbine to produce energy, and then products are flowing outwards. Realistically, again, having that analogy to metabolic pathways, you release energy in a series of reactions. Okay, let's say like glycolysis. Okay, we have glucose turning into pyruvate, ultimately converting to carbon dioxide. Okay. Cell respiration. So it goes from one reaction that will induce another reaction, that will induce another reaction, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. So it's never a one-to-one basis. It's a multi-step process. Okay? So by having this ability, the reactants turning into the products of one reaction will become the reactants of a new reaction. Okay? So that will prevent, and this is probably one of the most important things that you need to know. Okay? By having a multi-step process, this will prevent equilibrium from ever reaching, ever being achieved, right? Because there's no accumulation of product. Okay? The product becomes the reactant of the next step, and then the final waste product is released. So an organism itself will never be in equilibrium, ideally, right? Ultimately, in that example of glycolysis and cell respiration, will turn in, glucose turns into pyruvate, acetyl-CoA, and then ultimately carbon dioxide, and then we release carbon dioxide. So we never accumulate carbon dioxide in our body. Okay, so that's a very, very interesting thing. Right? As our initial products keep coming in, the products keep coming out, so our bodies and our cells will never reach equilibrium. Very, very interesting thing. Okay, now we're going to talk about ATP and coupling. This is a very important concept here. So 8.3 is ATP powers cellular work by coupling exergonic reactions to endergonic reactions. A little bit more insight here. So cells, more specifically, they can do 3 types of work, right? Chemical work. And here you have, endergonic reactions that will not occur spontaneously. They'll be able to do this by chemical work. And that's what we're going to look at, ATP use. And an example of this is polymerization, right? You need some energy to produce polymerization. Okay, that will not occur spontaneously. Transport work, pumping of substances across membranes, generally moving across against the direction of spontaneous movement. Okay, like active transport. We're going to take a look at in the next chapter. And mechanical work, right? The beating of cilia, muscle contractions, chromosomal movement during cell division, okay? Metaphase, in every phase essentially, right? Mechanical work. So in order to do all these types of work and enable the cell to be more efficient, you have to have a concept called energy coupling. And it's the use of an exergonic process to drive an endergonic reaction. Okay, using an exergonic reaction to drive a endergonic reaction. And what drives this is usually ATP. Okay, ATP mediates most energy couplings in cells. Okay, so we need to dive into ATP a little bit more. We talked about ATP around chapter 4, if I remember, chapter 4 or 5, if I remember correctly. So the structure and hydrolysis of ATP. As we know already, ATP is essentially composed of a sugar, okay, a sugar ribose, an adenine nitrogenous base, as you can see here, okay, adenine, a ribose here, and then you have 3 phosphate groups, okay? And these 3 phosphate groups is what actually provides that energy to chemical reactions. And ATP is one of the nucleoside triphosphates that make RNA. Okay? Nucleoside triphosphates that make RNA. And moreover, what's important is this here. Bonds between the phosphate groups can be broken down by hydrolysis. Okay? And when you hydrolyze, looking at this panel here, so you have ATP. When you hydrolyze ATP, the third phosphate is broken. Okay? It's released here. And that hydrolysis can also liberate energy to whatever it's coupled to. Okay? And that last phosphate gets released, gets hydrolyzed, it's broken out. Whenever you have this phosphate just floating around, okay, it is known as inorganic phosphate, and you're going to see this conventional depiction of inorganic phosphate as P sub I. Okay, and this leaves ATP either to a molecule, mostly to a molecule. It attaches to another molecule. And that leads ATP turning into ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So this is a lower energy molecule, okay, that needs to be restored later on. So this reaction is exergonic. It releases 7.3 kilocalories of energy per mole of ATP. You can see here in this equation, the hydrolysis of ATP will produce negative 7.3 kilocal. So where's that energy coming from that enables it to be an exergonic reaction? Is because the phosphate groups have negative charges. And these like charges, I'm going to give this a little sub notes here. So like charges, they tend to repulse each other. And because of that repulsion, it provides a sense of instability in these molecules. So having that instability, that's potential energy that can be provided for any other reaction or molecule or subsystem inside the cell. Okay. So how ATP provides energy that performs work. This is a very, very important diagram that we'll see here. So with the help of enzymes, ATP can drive chemical reactions that would themselves be endergonic. Okay? Themselves would be endergonic, but with the help of enzymes and with the help of ATP, these reactions can thrive better and be executed better, as we're going to take a look. Okay. There's a couple of things that happen. So if the delta G, all right, remember that delta, the delta G, the free energy of endergonic reaction, is less than the amount of energy released by ATP. Okay, I'm going to highlight this for you guys to have. Then two reactions can couple together. Okay? Two reactions can couple together. So coupled reactions are exergonic. Okay? And this involves the use of ATP in phosphorylation. As we're going to see in the diagram I'm going to go over. So what is phosphorylation? It's whenever there's a transfer of a phosphate group from ATP to another molecule. So that third phosphate will become attached to ATP, to that X molecule they want to take a look at. And you would say, my apologies for the bell. You would say that the molecule has become phosphorylated and it's in an intermediate form. It's a more reactive, unstable form. Okay, it's a phosphorylated intermediate. So let's take a look at this example here. You have a reaction that you want to produce glutamine, right? So let's look at letter A. Glutamic acid conversion to glutamine. Glutamine synthesis, so you have glutamic acid by itself would be endergonic, meaning that we would require energy, right? G is positive, so it is not spontaneous. It's not energetically favorable. So you have glutamic acid plus ammonia. This would produce glutamine. Fine. Okay. You have delta G that will have 3.4 kilocalories, right? A positive. The conversion, so you have now this a conversion reaction when you have it coupled with ATP hydrolysis. So now looking at it coupled together, let's take a look. So it says in a cell, glutamine synthesis occurs in two steps, coupled by a phosphorylated intermediate. So if you see here, number one, glutamic acid will react with ATP. That ATP would pass a phosphate, the third phosphate, to glutamic acid. So now, if you see here, you have that third phosphate that has bonded to glutamic acid. And now you have ADP. Because of this bonding of this phosphate, you have glutamic acid is more unstable. So you have a phosphorylated intermediate. So it has more free energy. And then you can get ammonia a lot easier to bind to this glutamic acid. Ammonia comes in, replaces this phosphate, okay, or displaces the phosphate group, and it'll form glutamine. Okay, and you have ADP plus inorganic phosphate. So because of this, okay, you have a net a delta G of free energy that is negative 3.99. So with the help of ATP, now this reaction has become a spontaneous, more favorable. Okay, so free energy change coupled for coupled reactions. So the delta G for glutamic acid to glutamine, what initially was 3.4, okay, plus the hydrolysis of the delta G of ATP hydrolysis, which is negative 3.7, okay, will give you a net reaction of 3.9 that is negative for delta G. Okay, because it is exergonic, it will occur spontaneous now. So ATP, in a nutshell, it kind of serves as a little battery that can provide a source of energy that can make molecules a little bit unstable, so they can react faster with the other reactant that they need to work with to create a particular product. Okay, let's go here to the next panel. And you can see this, again, not just with glutamic acid and glutamine synthesis, but you see this a lot with active transport work, right? We're going to see this, how we have transmembrane proteins that are embedded within the cell membrane to pass molecules, inside the cell or outside of the cell. This can require ATP. ATP can phosphorylate the protein, changing its shape to enable a solute to move from one place to another, right? After it gets phosphorylated and the work is done, the phosphate can be liberated into the cytoplasm, for example, or in the intercellular space. It could also be used for mechanical work. We're going to see these motor proteins. They literally move on a microtubule, right, or a cytoskeletal tract to move a vesicle about from A to B to wherever it needs to go. So the use of ATP, very, very important. Okay, this is essentially what I talked about right now. Transport and mechanical work can change the protein shape. Okay, the motor protein example that I just mentioned. Okay. Just to give more detail there. So you have the cycle of ATP there is non-covalently bonded. ATP gets hydrolyzed, releasing ADP and inorganic phosphate. And then, again, as you keep using ATP, more ATP can come. So the cycle can repeat again and again. Okay. Phosphorylation, dephosphorylation can be both change the protein shape. Phosphorylation alters the shape. Dephosphorylation can revert it back. Okay. So the regeneration of ATP. This is called the ATP cycle. We're going to see this again when in cell respiration. ADP needs to be phosphorylated, okay, because it needs to get that third phosphate back. Working muscles recycle its pool of ATP in less than a minute. That's very interesting information, right? 10 million molecules of ATP are used and regenerated per second per cell. That's how fast our cells work. It's mind-blowing. So again, it's not spontaneous to be re-energizing ATP. Yes, there are exergonic pathways, especially cell respiration provides the necessary energy, and that itself. But you need energy to give ATP its energy back. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say here. And again, plants also use light energy to produce ATP in the light reactions. So looking at this ATP cycle, All right, let's take a look at this. So you have ATP cycle and the energy released by the breakdown reactions. Okay, catabolic reactions. So you're having energy coming in from catabolism. Cell respiration will energize and enable the inorganic phosphate and ADP to produce ATP. Okay? And also a product of that is water. But then you can also use water to hydrolyze ATP, releasing energy for other cellular work, ultimately creating ADP and inorganic phosphate. So these reactions are always cycling between each other. Okay, to produce the use or the synthesis, of ATP in water uses 7.3 kilocalories. So this is what I'm referring to. That is an endergonic reaction ultimately. Okay, coming from an exergonic series of reactions of cell respiration. Okay. Right. So this is a very important panel here, the ATP cycle. Okay. All right. So I'm going to finish this this chapter. I'm going to split it into 2 videos, and in the next one we'll begin talking about enzymes. So hopefully this was helpful for you, and I'll see you in the next part. Thank you.